This video is part 2 of Chapter 13, Getting a Job with Your Bachelor's Degree for PSY 120, Careers in Psychology, Neuroscience, and Human Development. We've already talked about LinkedIn a little bit, but your authors have some advice on how to set up your LinkedIn profile. I know that some of you may have been asked to do this even in high school, which I think is a little early, but some other majors also at the university ask their students to prepare a LinkedIn profile as a part of some sort of professional development course. If you don't yet have a LinkedIn profile and you know you're going to be on the job market, it's a good idea to put one together. What LinkedIn does, it allows you to connect with other people in the same kind of areas that you're in. Building that kind of professional network, especially if you're going to work in business and industry, can be really invaluable. With your account, you can create kind of what your authors call a professional persona. Essentially, it's a more in-depth but also digitally organized representation of your resume, with also some ways of demonstrating the way you link yourself to other people across different professional areas. Basic accounts are in fact free. If you want a more professional account, I mentioned in the last lecture, it can be fairly pricey to do that. Around, I think a professional account is about $40 a month. But the basic account, which you can set up your profile, you can search for jobs, you can do all kinds of things, including building a network for free. You can also do some research looking at companies, looking at how they present themselves in that professional environment. You can look for people to connect with, employees at various companies, to learn more about what those companies are about. You can also find people who share your interests in psychology. The kind of content that you want to include on your LinkedIn profile is outlined by Kuther and Morgan. Headlines, a representation of your education. They kind of walk you through step by step what to put in. I try to encourage students to avoid using marketing cliches with their headlines. If they have one, I don't even know if I have one. But you do want to be crystal clear and highly accurate with your descriptions of your education, your experience, organizations you have been involved in or are currently involved in, specific skills that you possess, including some volunteer work if you've done some, especially if it's related to skills that you have or related to your community involvement. That can show potential employers what you're about. I have seen some students when they're younger, 20-somethings just out of their undergraduate program, they may list certain courses that they have, particularly if they are highly relevant to skill sets. So for example, if you have experience using SPSS, which all majors in our programs will have, that's something to highlight. If you have experience with Excel, if you have experience with Office products, you can highlight those capacities because those are sometimes recognized as important elements to particular jobs. You can also build a summary of who you are, what you are wanting to do, and that can help employers know sort of what your goals and values are going forward. Your profile photo, and I'm pretty key in violating this, I don't have a good professional photo on LinkedIn. If you are actively in the job market, it's worth the time and effort to get a good headshot done of you. It doesn't have to be professionally done, but it does need to look like a high quality, high resolution image of you without much of a distracting background. Something that includes your head, the top of your shoulders, wearing decent clothes, a good smile can make you seem more approachable, You can use editing apps, but do so very sparingly, as your authors suggest. Using filters and fun photos, while appropriate on some social media sites, isn't seen as appropriate on LinkedIn. Nor are just like cute vacation shots. I used to have a picture of one of my dogs was my profile picture, but then again, I'm not looking for a job, so I can break some of those rules periodically. But if you are currently on the job market, remember that your whole LinkedIn profile is essentially a resume. References and getting reference letters is an important consideration, whether you're going into the job market or you're getting references for your graduate school application. Key targets that you're going to use for your reference letters, if you are a college student, are going to be your faculty, people who know you, they've interacted with you, they've had experiences with you, and can competently write about your skills and abilities, as well as your personal characteristics. You definitely don't want to just assume that faculty will write a good letter for you. You need to carefully consider the nature of your experiences with the people that you ask for references, because they are going to want to comment on your abilities, your personal traits, your performance, your dependability, and so on. If you have had mixed experiences with a given person, maybe you didn't do well in one of their classes, or you had conflicts, or if it's just someone you don't particularly know well, you may want to pursue other individuals to write your letters for you. Professors, research supervisors, managers, people you've interacted with on internships or practica can give good evaluations if they know you well. Just make sure that you're being honest with yourself and with your potential letter writers about what your expectations and goals are. Do remember that you must, it's an ethical issue and it's also a practical issue, you must ask the person before listing them on your resume or putting them down as a reference on an application. I can tell you from my own perspective that I find it annoying, and in some cases, I find it a bit offensive when I get an email out of the blue from a university saying so-and-so has asked you to write a recommendation letter for them, but the student has not asked me first. The reason why I require that a student ask me first is because in some cases, they don't want me to write that letter for them, because ethically, I am required to be honest with my assessment of students. If it's a student who has had mixed performance with me, that's exactly what I'm going to tell that university, because my professional reputation rests on me being honest and candid about that potential student's performance in my experience. So remember that you owe your letter writers the courtesy of asking them first. You also should expect that you have to provide them with enough information to make a detailed enough letter, a full enough letter that it will actually be helpful to you. Letters that are ineffective are letters that are brief and general. Letters that are effective are letters that contain specific examples, specific information about skills and competencies and social interactions. So you do need to provide your letter writers with a resume or a CV. And I always ask for your personal statement. If you're applying to graduate school or applying to a job, I ask to see the cover letter so that I can add my experience with you to my letter based on your expectations and your understanding of the position you're applying for. Do not surprise your references. As I just mentioned, it annoys us. It makes us unhappy. and therefore you're less likely to get a good letter if you get a letter at all. So kind of feel out your potential letter writers and make sure that they are comfortable recommending you for a job or writing a letter for you for graduate school. Cover letters, and again, I'm going to be very brief here because you've already worked through this process in assignment 5. Employers are going to want to read that cover letter very quickly, and they want to recognize in that cover letter that you really are, in fact, knowledgeable about the job and you want the job. So the cover letter puts your resume into context, puts it in the first person so that you're talking about yourself as you relate to this job. It needs to be pretty brief, but offer enough of an explanation to a potential employer that they can say they have a good feeling about who you are and your appropriateness for this job. In your cover letter, you need to highlight the most important aspects of your background that are going to be relevant to the position as advertised, and you need to provide accurate contact information. That includes your phone number and your email address. Speaking of your phone number, if you have a weird music that plays in the background when somebody calls you, or especially if that music contains profanities, make sure that you remove that from your voicemail. Make your voicemail personal. So say you have reached and give your full name so that a potential employer who hears that voicemail message knows it's you and it's not someone who's behaving in a childish manner. Also provide your email address. I mentioned in the previous presentation, if your email has a goofy sounding introduction like puppylover@gmail.com, you might want to change that or get a second account for professional purposes that has your name as a part of the email address, because that's seen as far more professional than a cute handle as an email address. If an employer is interested in you, interviewing is an important part of the process of actually getting the job. For most jobs, an interview is going to be required. How you present yourself in an interview context is often seen by potential employers as the single most important predictor of whether you will get the job. How you present yourself can actually offset other issues like grades and related experience. Basically, you have to think of interviews as your one opportunity to be impressive. So whether it's an in-person interview or an online interview, it is your one chance to be impressive to this person who's interviewing you. It's not uncommon these days to have multiple interviews. That was almost unheard of about 10 years ago, but now interviewing in a lot of industries is in rounds. So you get past the video interview, then you'll have an in-person. If you get past that first level of interview, then it might go up to, so you might start with an HR level interview, you might then go up to a managerial interview, and then you might go up to someone even higher than that for a final interview. It can be exhausting, it can be stressful, but it's becoming more normative in many businesses to have that multiple rounds of interviews. And again, it just shows how important interviews are in this process of hiring today. One of the reasons that Mount Union places such an emphasis on oral communication as part of our general education, our integrative core, is because you need these sorts of soft skills. You need the ability to present yourself, to be well-spoken, to be able to discuss and clearly define what your professional goals are, and to do so in a personal way in interview. You have to be prepared. Go into the interview having thought through what you're going to say and how you're going to say it, what questions you're going to ask, and very clearly have a real solid handle on how you want to present your qualifications. While interviews can be stressful, they can also they can benefit by you practicing them in advance. Our career development office can give you the context where you can practice for interviewing to reduce your level of anxiety about going into them. Interviews often involve some fairly common questions. You should expect to be asked why you want to work for them. You should expect questions about the position and some sort of way of assessing the way why you think you are appropriate for that position. They will want to know about your qualifications, and they will want you to talk about them. In some cases, you will be just asked flat out, why should we hire you? And you need to have an answer for that. While they don't want you to be boastful and extreme, they will also want you to be clear about why you feel yourself to be well suited. So you have to talk yourself up without seeming to be egocentric. Like you don't want to present yourself as the world's gift to their company because you're going to be super awesome. But at the same time, you need to show confidence and certainty that you are a good fit for that position. They will also want to ask you some questions about how you are going to meet what they need. Excuse me. Part of what they're doing in this conversation is getting some kind of sense, some kind of feel for your trustworthiness. And, that's a really hard thing to assess in interpersonal communication, but it's certainly something that people are doing when they're in an interview situation. Part of preparation for an interview is to think about how you're dressed. You definitely don't want to dress the way you normally come to class. So you have to think about the culture of the organization. And sometimes you can ask these questions of individuals who are familiar with the company and familiar with the organization. So you want to dress appropriately for the interview, attempt to dress professionally. If it's unclear how you should dress, you should probably dress in a professional manner. So for many people, suits, for male identifying individuals, you may want to consider a suit and tie. For female identifying people, you may want to consider a suit, a dress, a skirt, that kind of thing to show your professional demeanor. In some workplaces, however, that isn't expected. If you can find out information about that, you can rely on it. But it's best to be safe rather than sorry in terms of hitting an appropriate level of professionalism. Why does how you appear matter? As unfair as it may seem, you have to make a first impression that is not going to harm your potential impression of the interviewer. So if there's something about your appearance that they find to be off-putting, it's very hard to overcome that over the course of an interview. So it's to your advantage to dress appropriate for the setting. If it's a company, even a company with a very casual dress code, dress better than you would if you were going to work there, so that you show that you care about how you're presenting yourself to this business, and you hope that they will see that as a sign of your seriousness and your interest in the position. So it conveys to that company how enthusiastic you are, how committed you are to the position. During the interview, it's recommended that you bring the interviewer a copy of your resume. This can be helpful in case you want to highlight something specific on your resume. You can refer to it. and it shows that you are professional and prepared for the interview. You should you should allow the interviewer to have control of the interview, asking the questions, directing the conversation. Be clear, be positive in your responses. An interview for a job is not a place to kind of rag on your current employer or your previous employer. It's not to talk about what you don't want to have happen on a job. You want to talk about the positive attributes of the job that you're looking at and the positive aspects of the company that you find attractive. As I just said, don't badmouth former employers or colleagues. It's not appropriate. You would be seen as a bad potential fit. You will be seen as somebody who's going to cause problems for that new employer. As the interviewer leads the conversation, they may go into the discussion of salary and benefits. Now, in some cases, that conversation will be brief and cursory. In others, it will be very specific. You can ask questions. In initial interviews, there's usually not much of a conversation about this other than in a fairly cursory form. Later interviews are a place for negotiation. If you go hard in a first interview and say you're not going to work for any less than X, you can kind of expect that you're not going to be invited back for another interview. Remind yourself that you will need to be flexible in terms of salary. Part of that flexibility means being aware of industry standard levels of compensation and benefits. So you should do some research and investigation into what's typical in your marketplace. If employers don't say when you're going to know about their decision, you can ask when it would be appropriate for you to call to follow up. That's a perfectly acceptable question. It also shows that at the close of the interview, you remain interested in them. Always remember to thank the interviewer and follow up with an email or a thank you note. If it's a particularly conservative organization, very traditional, that thank you note is sometimes better perceived if it's actual paper through snail mail. In other contexts, that's not really relevant. An email to the interviewer is likely to be sufficient. If you are offered a job, many of these offers these days are made over the phone. Sometimes they're made in person. Sometimes they're made through email. It just really depends on the context. Before you accept an offer, make sure you understand what is exactly being offered to you. And that includes understanding the salary, understanding the benefits, the evaluation system, and so on. In some cases, there's very little room for negotiation, and you will often be told that if that is the case. You can, depending on your understanding of the industry, and that takes you doing your homework in advance. You will have to, politely but firmly negotiate for what you feel is fair and appropriate to your level of experience and expertise. If you're talking about entry-level positions, you're not going to have very much room for negotiation. As you climb the ladder, you will have more. That concludes my coverage of Chapter 13.